Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Just a quick look now backward. People are comparing this current wave of destabilizations, coups, putches, and civil wars to 1848. 1848 was a big revolutionary year, and remember, in those days, a lot of Europe was dominated by these empires. The Russian Empire, which dominated Poland, the Austro-Hungarian or Austrian Empire, which dominated the entire spectrum of people in Southeast Europe, the Danube Valley. And, of course, then there was the growing state of Prussia, which had picked up a Polish minority itself. 1848, basically, you have the British with Lord Palmerston, Lord John Russell, people like this, looking at the Holy Alliance being Austria, Russia, and Prussia, saying, how can we destabilize them? And one of the answers was to play the card of nationalism, and this was done through Mazzini, Giuseppe Mazzini, an agent of the British Admiralty, a paid agent of a guy called Stansfeld, who was an official of the British Admiralty. And revolution starts in Sicily in January, sort of similar to this year. You start with a revolution in January in a peripheral area down in Sicily, and then it becomes a wave across the continent. And as R.R. Palmer writes in his History of the Modern World, contemporaries sometimes attributed the universality of the revolutionary phenomenon in 1848 to the machinations of secret societies. And it is true that the beginnings of an international revolutionary movement existed before 1848, and that's Mazzini, young Germany, young France, young Poland, young Italy, young England, young, and other groups, right? So groups like the Society of the Seasons in Paris that organized coups d'etats, and these were generally in the orbit of British intelligence. So starts in Sicily in January, and then it becomes a revolution in France. At least it becomes a coup in France in February 22nd, 1848. The King of France, Louis Philippe, is forced to flee to London, sort of like Mubarak. And then it becomes in March, it kicks over to Vienna, where it spreads, and the revolution continues to gather strength until June. And in June, you have the high point or low point, the June days of 1848, which is class warfare breaking out in Paris. General Cavaignac, bloody crushing of the Paris working class. Now, these are proletarians, a lot of them organized by the national workshops. Interestingly, in France, there's a period of democratic interlude, you might say, 1848. But by the end of the year, you have Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the later Napoleon III, being elected president, and by 1852, he declares himself to be the restored empire. He becomes Napoleon III. This is a regime that has many characteristics of modern fascism, but above all, it is a puppet state of the British. There's a lot of changes, but the result is that the people who are left standing when the 1848 dust clears are more weakened and more controlled by the British than whatever was there before. So France, it goes from a democratic revolution, the Second Republic, but then the Second Republic is taken over by the Emperor Napoleon III, who starts this regime, which is largely a negative. In Austria, you have not just the revolt of the Austrian anti-Habsburg types, the Republicans, the liberals, but you've also got the rebellion of everybody else, the Hungarians, the Italians. Everybody else in the empire decides that they have had enough. However, in Austria, after a period of about 6 months of chaos, you get the Habsburgs appointing a guy called Schwarzenberg as the prime minister, and he brings in two generals, General Windischgrätz, who puts down the rebellion north of the Alps. He basically cleans up Hungary and other places, and then we have General Radetzky in northern Italy. So he prevents Milan and Venice and other areas from getting out of the Austrian Empire. So in Italy, it's crushed. In Italy, it also turns into an actual war with the Piedmontese or Sardinian army coming across to try to fight, kick the Austrians out. And the Italians are defeated in a couple of battles, Custozza and some others. In Germany, you have a big upsurge, which leads to the creation of the Frankfurt Assembly in May of 1848. And the question is, will you have a republic in Germany? And the answer, of course, is no. They decide to offer the crown to the King of Prussia, who won't even take it. He says, I'm not going to pick up a crown from the gutter. And then in Austria in particular, the result of all this is what? It's a very, very severe dictatorship of reactionaries. Thence comes the word. Under the Interior Minister Bach, and this has been described as a standing army of soldiers, a sitting army of officials, a kneeling army of priests, and a creeping army of informers and spies. So that's what goes on in Austria. So it gives you an idea. People who say, well, what we've seen now in the last 2 weeks shows that democracy is coming across the Arab world. I would say chaos is coming first. And on the other side of chaos is probably authoritarian regimes. Now, the Anglo-American hope is that those authoritarian regimes will be more dependent on London and Washington than the ones we've seen so far, more globalized and less able to turn to Russia, China, Iran, India, Brazil, or anybody else. That may or may not happen. And it's always possible when you start these revolutions, as the British found out, right, that you start something, maybe you can't control it. Maybe a Frankenstein phenomenon comes in, and you get a Tamerlane out of it. Suppose somebody comes sweeping up out of Africa and unites the entire continent, or a Napoleon, right, is the same idea. You start the French Revolution, as the British did, and for a while it's chaos, but then it turns into exporting the revolution, and that becomes Napoleon, and that is, at least for a time, a direct threat to the British themselves. All right, so that's the 1848 parallel. Take a look at any decent history textbook of, say, pre-1970 or pre-1960, and you'll get an idea of what goes on. And again, our orientation, turn the imperialist destabilization of the world into a destabilization of world imperialism. In other words, judo it. Once these ferments start and the ideologies enter into crisis, people can intervene. It may be that there are nationalist colonels somewhere in the Egyptian army who are ready to reassert their sovereignty against the Tantawi and related sellouts who have driven Mubarak out of power. We'll soon find out. Back in a minute.